Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Dignan. I'm sorry I couldn't make it up there. I was very excited, but I wanted to participate in any way I could, so I made this video, and I hope you enjoy it. A couple things about me are that I played lacrosse at UMBC, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I was a defenseman there. I have a rescue dog named Ace, who is so important to me that I included the slide of him in the snow. Plus, everyone loves to see a cute dog. Um, Additionally, my educational background. I earned my bachelor's and master's from UMBC. I was originally planning to go into business with the economics major, but I had a change of heart and found my true passion within teaching. And a long story short, and a lesson learned that I always say is I should have just listened to my mom from the beginning instead of putting myself in the situation of changing my major in my last semester of my senior year. So there's always something to learn from it. Also, I just began an online EDD with the American College of Education. Professional experience. I'm a first year teacher, and I had previously interned on Wall Street, which, if I was there, you would see me in a blue suit, which is the real shame of this all because you won't get to see me. And what my students say makes me look like a big blueberry. So, yeah, moving on. One of the assignments that I had to do within my master's program, probably the biggest, was called an SLO, Student Learning Objective. And we had to pick a topic and try and increase student understanding of whatever that topic was. And I chose to focus on race and the perception surrounding it because I had some great professors at UMBC. We talked about these topics, and they really helped me understand it better. And I just thought about where I was in high school and where I was now, and then I felt like high school didn't really prepare me for the way that the world was in many ways. So the abstract of my assignment goes as following. A core component for social studies students to learn and develop is awareness of civil injustice. Social equity is a complex issue that impacts student lives in many different ways, yet it continues to be an underlying and often avoided issue, both within schools and society. Therefore, it is crucial to address historic events that have created systemic structures which continue to perpetuate racial inequality today. The school setting in which the study is being conducted is suburban, with a moderately diverse mix of students both racially and socioeconomically. The political science class is made up of 45 students across two separate sections. The sections are made up of seniors with 4 juniors. The objective is to increase student understanding and awareness of systemic racism and the effect that these structures have on equity within society. To achieve this objective, students will interact with and analyze balanced multimedia texts and engage in dialogue and reflection over the course of 2 weeks. A mixed method approach will be taken to analyze their progress before, during, and after the course of study. A quantitative test will measure student understanding, with a qualitative free response section being used to measure awareness. And the measure in which I was using to increase awareness was to try and get them to a score of 8 on a rubric based on the following questions, which you will see here. So this is the results of quiz 1, which is basically the base findings for students' existing knowledge. And the significance of the quiz 1 results really, in my opinion, cannot be overstated. And that's because the results demonstrated, or the population is by seniors in the top 20 high school in one of the most diverse states in the country. Yet, even there, we could say that their understanding of systemic racism, why, what it is, how it is very low, especially when we consider the relative difficulty of the questions being asked. Which, again, this quiz 1 is basically saying that without intervention by a school to openly and directly teach the concepts surrounding these topics, there is little understanding within those that graduate and then therefore go out into society, which just represents, a need for change, and we've identified an issue. Yeah. And then the next couple slides here, these are slides that it's only a couple of them, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly just to show the concepts that we talked about. because again, it was over the course of some time. I'm going to break it down kind of quick. But these slides that you'll see here are elements of what we talked about. So the first one here, I started with RFK. We'd watched a previous speech that he'd given after Martin Luther King was killed, and I basically fast forward to a crucial part where he says we have to make an effort. We have to make an effort in the United States to understand. And given the significance of it being right after Martin Luther King was killed, it was surrounding the issue of race at the time, and then later RFK gets killed around 2 months later. And we talked about what all this meant and what American society was going through not that long ago. Next, we went and talked about, we transitioned into conversation about the history of America and its lasting impact. And we intentionally, I didn't start with slavery. We wanted to uncover when and how the effects of racism continue to linger in more subtle but powerfully damaging ways. And I'll talk about that more later on, why I wanted to start here, because it does go much farther back. But a lot of times students know that and they won't deny that. It's when you get to more recent times that you begin to see in them, especially in a political science class, the evolution of denial of certain things. So I wanted to start here just to focus on it. And so we talked about Plessy v. Ferguson. We talked about separate but equal in the division that it created within society, Brown v. Board of Education, lack of resources that were distributed to minorities. And during discussion, I asked the students to consider how important is education? Why do we come to school? Why do we have school? What does it allow for? What does an education allow for? Was society always fair? What kind of long-term effects does something like this or these do? And has America created a society that provides equal opportunity for all? Many, and I wouldn't say many, but at this time, a considerable amount of the students said yes. They said yes. Furthermore, then we evolved into housing and kind of how it's an investment, and education, how it provides opportunity, and then talked about one of the most important things that, in my mind, that happened that none of the students knew about as seniors. Again, redlining, and we discussed the effects of redlining and how racism was displayed by specifically preventing upward mobility, even for soldiers, African American soldiers that came home after fighting in World War II, but were denied loans, and that whites were able to buy houses as an investment for the future with record low interest rates, but African Americans were specifically denied because of how the government classified them and the financial implications it would have surrounding home ownership. Introduced the concept of socioeconomic segregation. I mean, even more powerful when you talk about property tax funding schools. And the relationship that exists within all these things and the effect that government policy had on it. So what relationship does housing and education have on opportunity? What has it done to society? And now I think in their minds, in many of the minds, those that were being honest with themselves, you could see in them, there was a conceptual evolution beginning to happen. And then furthermore, housing and education continued. We talked about the racial divide within education today. We watched Waiting for Superman. We watched the whole movie. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's very good. And it talks about charter schools a good bit, but it also introduced students to what other high schools were like in the country. That as much as they hated their high school, they were extremely fortunate. And a couple other things that we did then. We looked at U.S. News, and we looked at my high school. And I have to move this around a little bit. We looked at the breakdown of race and then economic disadvantage. And I didn't really say much about it to them, but just to look at it, and wonder why that is. And again, we'd already talked about socioeconomic segregation a little bit before. And then we would do the same thing and Unfortunately, I'm running out of time here, but we would do the same thing. And then we looked at Baltimore City, and that the rates, the diversity was much higher, but so was socioeconomic struggling. And it was just something to talk about. Why was that? Why did this happen? We then furthermore talked about poverty. We played a great game called Play Spent. How does it happen? How does one get out? What is it like? What are the long-term effects? This is the game here. You basically play it. It's very interactive. The students loved it. And yeah, you have to find a job and then make a variety of decisions, which was very good. And again, this is just trying to give them the experience of what was happening outside of where they were currently and historically. We had a lot of discussion then about the following people, speeches that they gave, what they were talking about during the time period where things began to shift a little bit from blatant racism to separate and more hidden racism, like economic segregation again, the effects of redlining. And then an interesting one that had a lot of effect, I would say, was we explored the song Changes by Tupac, which was certainly controversial, but printed out the lyrics and discussed his message and what he was saying, which was extremely effective because all the students have heard his name, who is Tupac? They'd raise their hand. Who's heard his songs? Who's thought about his songs? Those hands would go down. So they know who he is, but they didn't know much about what his message was. And we'd analyzed the lyrics and then had a great discussion about that, which was probably one of the most impactful because I think it can relate to the students. It can relate to the age. They're curious. They want to see what someone who is an icon had to say about it. And unfortunately, I'm not in presentation mode, but after all of that, this was essentially the results of the same questions being asked and with them writing down what they thought and giving examples. And it was much better. It was much more where we'd like to see. And again, this was only over a 2-week period. And moving forward here, you can see the individual growth that students gave. And a lot of them showed extremely good progress with what admittedly was little teaching by an intern. And I think that they really did learn, and it's extremely powerful. And I have to speed it up here now. But there were some challenges with students like number 19 where no progress was made, and 23 over here, right here, and right here, where they didn't meet the objective, but they demonstrated growth. And that growth may have created a new lens for them to see the world through. And it is certainly a cleaner lens for them. And then in the conclusion, the problem basically that I think, the barriers to academic assimilation of Black and brown children into Western culture is that it's not being done because it's not understood by society. And the reality of systemic racism is that it's more hidden, so students don't have that understanding or that exposure. Economic segregation has created limited exposure to the lives of other Americans, and it's kind of kept that way. So what do we need to do? It's schools' responsibility to take a much more aggressive action. So we have to teach it, address the issue, have conversation, results will occur. And we have to teach it for what it is. It's fact. It needs to start being defended as fact and stand up for that, because it is certainly controversial to talk about race and mark someone wrong when they say systemic racism doesn't exist. But it does. And that's kind of where school needs to come in facilitating our society, because currently public education is significantly inequitable, lacks a representatively diverse curriculum, and overall fails to earn its cultural importance in our society. So we have to address it, either intentional or unintentional, and how it continues to destabilize the future outcomes of young American minorities, as it is morally necessary and factually justifiable, because right now there is little facilitation of our society, and we can see that in Quiz 1. Right now, sectors of public education are playing their part in perpetuating the systemic issue, sadly, when they hold the key to unlocking it. So changes are needed, and it begins with teaching it. Teachers facilitate society. Thank you very much.